All right, I have some final recommendations for you concerning how not to be three revisions from greatness. First of all, let's talk about intentional plagiarism. In the last academic year, I had 6 students who failed classes due to intentional plagiarism. And I'm not talking about a paragraph or two. These students found whole articles online, copied and pasted them into a document, and presented them as their own. That's a case where it's intentional, and over the course of my career, the percentage of students who do something like that is small, and I'm happy about that. The idea in doing research is to give credit where credit is due. And if you present someone's work as your own, someone who's worked a long time to develop ideas, maybe spent their whole career in research developing ideas, you present those as your own, you have stolen their ideas. And that is unethical, immoral, and in some cases illegal. The good thing about research, the kind of research you're doing here in this class, is that you don't have to have any original thoughts. Actually, I don't want to know your opinion about the topic you picked. The purpose of a research paper is to look at what others have done and do the critical thinking and good judgment to put that together in a readable form. And that's what this class is all about. So you don't have to have any groundbreaking Nobel Prize winning thoughts in here, but you do need to demonstrate in the topic you pick that you are well read. A lot of what I see in terms of students who commit plagiarism is minor and a result of innocent mistakes. I've done this. Actually, most of the things I talk about in this class is mistakes or mistakes that I have made as a student. A common thing students do is they take sloppy notes. The problem I have when I read 20 or 30 sources is that I can't remember what I've read. And I'll look at a note I made 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I don't know if that was my summary of an article, or if it was just my own thought I inserted in my notes, or if it's a direct quote. So I've learned to be very careful when you're taking notes, to put quotation marks around those things that are the exact words of the original. And if I have a thought as I'm going through taking my notes, I always label it as my thought, so later on there's no ambiguity about what that was. But it's easy enough to forget to put quotes around something and then think it's a summary and put it in your paper, and it shows up on safe assignments, and you didn't do anything intentional. It's just a result of sloppy research. So take notes carefully. But I want you to know that although you might get a grade deduction for not putting quotation marks around a sentence, you're not going to fail the class over that. Let's talk about incorporating evidence into your paper. When I see long quotes, block quotes, in Turabian this is 5 lines or longer, or if I see lots of them, it means that you are repeating the argument of the original source. And that's not research, that's just parroting what someone else has said. The problem with long quotes is that it indicates in most cases, unless you're citing a law or something that's necessary to make your point, it indicates mental laziness. The worst response I've ever gotten is a student that came back with a paper that was about 80% direct quotes, just one quote after another. And when I asked her why she used so many quotes, she said, well, I didn't understand them, so I thought if I just copied and pasted them into the paper, maybe you would understand them. That's the wrong answer. Susan Hubbock is a textbook, the author of a text we used to use in this class. It says you need to use your sources rather than having your sources use you. While what you write is not original in content, the thoughts aren't original. What is original is the way you put those thoughts together. That's the synthesis part and the critical thinking part of this course. Something we call a passive sponge paper is like maybe a junior high or elementary school report, where an author only reads one source, maybe Wikipedia in the worst case, and simply writes down what they said. That's just accepting what someone else has said and one-source papers are very weak and certainly does not meet the criteria or the level of paper we're looking for in this class. A good research paper references many sources, and that's why I call for a minimum of 16 sources in this class. I know that's putting pressure on you to look for resources, but part of this class is learning how to dig into the online library databases and find those authoritative sources. You're going to be using two main kinds of evidence when you write your paper. One are summaries of sources and also probably paraphrases. I've encouraged you from the beginning of the term that your notes not consist only of quotes. And it's tempting because of technology to just copy and paste everything you read. The problem with that, if your notes consist only of direct quotes, is that you wind up at the end of the semester trying to paraphrase or summarize everything at once. And this is where students sometimes get into trouble with illegitimate paraphrase, where they just changed a word or two in the quote and leave the rest of it intact. If you take summaries and paraphrase as you go, when it comes time to write the paper, you won't have created that monster of all just exact quotes. Statistics are another important thing that you'll use to write your paper. However, it is not wise to devote a whole section of your paper to statistics. Just think about it from the perspective of a reader. If you read one sentence of numbers after another, it doesn't take long to reach your saturation point. So look at statistics and quotes too as supplementary evidence and not the main thing for what you're doing. Another is when you're using statistics, use only those that are necessary. In other words, never drop in a table with no explanation for why that table is there. Tables and graphs, if you do feel like it's necessary to include them, go in the appendix. A poor man's paraphrase, or an illegitimate paraphrase, which I alluded to just a minute ago, changes only a few words or phrases of an original quote, and it also presents ideas in their original order. If you are making a point for your paper, you're almost never going to present all the ideas in an original quote because they won't all pertain to your paper. So to avoid that, always look at the point you're trying to make. Don't get too obsessed with the structure of the original quote. If you use summaries, remember summaries are much shorter versions than an original. Let's say you read a 10-page paper, a summary may be only a sentence or two. If you use summaries, you're almost never going to duplicate the exact words of an original source. When you paraphrase something, think about how does the paraphrase or how does the original passage fit into your research question? How does it address that? And then write your point out in a sentence. And then when you do write your paraphrase, acknowledge the source of the idea in your paragraph. Turabian chapter 25 has a great section that deals with this, and I recommend you take a look at that. Another is don't reiterate the whole argument of the author. And if there are things where you say there's no other way to express this in the English language, just put quotation marks around the exact words and phrases and then put the page number that it came from. For quotes, view them as supporting evidence and use them when the point you want to make is best illustrated by the words of another. For instance, if you were quoting President Kennedy, where he says, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country, you wouldn't want to paraphrase that or summarize it. You want to give his original quote to highlight what he said. So sometimes a quote is very good to draw attention to something. When you do that, though, it's best to incorporate quotes into a sentence and then include a direct acknowledgement of the source rather than having quotes set separately or using block quotes. Actually, in a paper of the length you're writing for this class, there shouldn't be any block quotes. Also think about, when you look at an original quote, what are the words that are necessary to make your point? Use only those words and no more. And the general rule is you shouldn't be using the words of others when you should express ideas in your own words. Too many quotes represents mental laziness. Remember that quoted material should never stand alone. You should always incorporate the words of others in your own sentences. And then there are occasions when you can't get to a source because it's a short term. In that case, it's allowable for you to use one or two secondary citations. In other words, you see a quote in a paper and you can't get to the original source of the quote. It's okay to cite the source that's citing the quote. And the rules for doing that are in the Turabian manual on page 215. So take a look at that. If you're going to do omissions in the text, that is represented by ellipsis points. And you can see an illustration of this on page 354 in the Turabian guide. But occasionally when you're quoting something, there's a phrase from a sentence that's not necessary to make your point. Or maybe the end of a sentence or the beginning of a sentence is not necessary to make your point. In that case, you can omit phrases. However, you're on your honor here because you can omit a phrase and change the meaning of a sentence. So you need to be faithful to represent the original meaning of the sentence from the source you found. Sometimes it's necessary to add words to quotes so that they'll make sense to your reader. If your reader hasn't read the whole section you have, if you're going to put additions in a sentence, you include those you indicate that you have inserted those by using square brackets. And an example of that is on page 353 of the Turabian guide. Finally, tone is the finishing touch. When we get to common errors, I'm going to talk about some specific things that affect tone. But in general, you should be mimicking the tone of the peer-reviewed articles you read about the topic you have chosen for the class. In other words, this is not like writing a letter to your friend. It's a formal academic paper. One thing we've talked about a lot in this class is documentation styles. And an important thing is that when you start using Turabian with footnotes, you don't reinvent the wheel. There's a consistent shorthand system that is spelled out in Turabian, and you need to be careful to use that consistently. So look at the example references in chapter 17 and follow them closely. For instance, if a student only gives me the author and the title of a work, and that's it, I don't know if it's a book, if it's a newspaper, if it's a journal article, what the publication year is. I can't tell anything about that. So be sure you can record all the data that's required in chapter 17 for different kinds of references. Some common styles you see in colleges is MLA, that is the Style Manual of the Modern Language Association, APA, which is the Style Manual of the American Psychological Association, and then what we're using in this term, which is Chicago Style, and we are using the Turabian short guide to Chicago Style. Some common errors in your paper. First, Turabian Chicago Style never uses all caps. When you go into the databases like EBSCO and you click the Cite button, it'll show you the reference formatted in Turabian style. However, one thing to remember is that Turabian never uses all caps. So if you see a title in all capital letters or an author's name in all capital letters, you can assume automatically that that is incorrect. And those citations are notoriously inaccurate. So even if you copy and paste it from EBSCO, it's your responsibility as a student to get those all formatted correctly. Also, since it's a formal paper, don't use contractions. Don't use can't, don't, your, or words like that. Spell it out. Cannot, do not, you are. Also, don't use first-person pronouns because this gives your paper a very informal feel. So don't use I, me, we and us. Some professors, especially in the School of Religion and Philosophy, have told me they will fail students for a paper if they use first person. So get in the habit of not doing that. That will get you in trouble. Another is don't address readers as you. So for instance, a student in the past has said, you shouldn't wear a string bikini on the beach because boys will get the impression that you're easy. Well, I'm not a cross-dresser and I don't wear bikinis. Another paper that said, when you're pregnant, well, I'm a guy, I can't be pregnant. If you address readers as you can come up with some pretty ridiculous situations, so just don't do that. Also, don't use slang like cool, dissing, freak out, or text messaging language, like instead of spelling out Y-O-U for you, just put the letter U. This is a formal paper. Also, avoid using first person. We just discussed that. One of my pet peeves is using the word feel in a research paper. I don't care about how you feel. I want to know what you think. Don't use feel. Also, proof is seldom used in research. Never use the word proof. You could say maybe strongly suggests or something like that, but always soften the language. Never use the word proof. You wrote an outline. You turned it into me. Remember that you have it. Genius level writers like Stephen King can write without using an outline, but you aren't Stephen King, so use one. And as you write, ask yourself how the section you're writing addresses your thesis. That's always important. And something I do when I write is that in the end, when I go through and I'm editing my own document, proofreading it, I find that there's always a paragraph or two that doesn't quite fit, that winds up on the cutting room floor before the paper gets submitted. It's good to put your rough draft aside for at least 24 hours. That means you have to give yourself the luxury of finishing the paper enough ahead of time that you can do that. And if you walk away from it for 24 hours, let it go cold, and come back to it, you'll see a lot of your own errors, and you can proofread it and take a lot of those things out, so that when it comes time to do the peer review, you can make it a lot easier for your friends in the class.